Cultural attaché Daniel Wright stood near the refreshment table at the annual Galactic Unity reception. Nursing a beverage that tasted like someone had fermented diplomatic compromise and trying not to look as bored as he felt. This was his sixth Unity reception in 4 years of diplomatic service, and they were always the same. Rigid protocol, carefully choreographed interactions, safe conversations about trade agreements, and absolutely no spontaneous gestures that might accidentally offend any of the 36 species in attendance. The reception included traditional cultural elements from various species, rotated yearly to ensure equal representation. This year, the Veltherin delegation had organized their circle dance, a ceremonial movement practice performed to demonstrate cultural heritage and promote understanding. Daniel had watched similar demonstrations at previous receptions, beautiful, precise, deeply meaningful to Veltherin culture, but always performed exclusively by Veltherin among themselves, never with outsiders, maintaining the cultural boundaries that everyone respected without question. Daniel watched the demonstration from his assigned position in the human delegations section. The Veltherin moved with natural grace, their long, elegant ears tracking rhythm, their movements synchronized perfectly. It was genuinely impressive, and Daniel appreciated the artistry even if he didn't fully understand the cultural significance. What caught his attention, though, was the young Veltherin woman standing at the edge of her own delegation, watching her people dance with an expression that looked like longing. Her name tag, all junior representatives wore them, identified her as Lyrie Shenville, Assistant Cultural Representative. When the formal demonstration concluded and her fellow Veltherin invited her to join the next cycle, she declined with the subtle hand gesture Daniel had learned meant polite refusal in Veltherin communication. She continued watching from the edges, and something about her posture reminded Daniel of himself at family gatherings, when his social anxiety kept him on the periphery of celebrations he wanted to join but couldn't quite access. The formal demonstrations concluded, and the reception shifted into social hour, the carefully orchestrated time when various species were supposed to mingle casually while maintaining appropriate diplomatic distance. A dance floor had been set up for general use, and neutral music began playing, orchestral compositions designed to offend no one. Daniel saw Lyrie standing alone near the dance floor, watching other species interact while maintaining her careful distance from both her own delegation and others. She looked at the floor like she wanted to be out there, but couldn't find a way to cross the space between wanting and doing. Daniel had no logical reason to approach her. He'd never spoken to Lyrie before, didn't know anything about her beyond her name tag, and interfering in another species' cultural practices was exactly the kind of diplomatic mistake his training warned against repeatedly. But something about that longing expression, that careful distance, felt familiar. And Daniel had spent too many years standing on the edges of celebrations to watch someone else do the same without at least offering an option. "Excuse me, Representative Lyrie," Daniel said, approaching before his diplomatic training could talk him out of it. "Would you like to dance?" The words were out before his brain fully processed their implications. Lyrie's long ears snapped forward in surprise, the Veltherin expression for shock or sudden attention. Her amber eyes fixed on Daniel with intensity that suggested she was trying to determine if she'd heard correctly. "I what?" she managed. "The dance floor is open for social hour. Would you like to dance with me?" Daniel could feel his face heating up. "I realize this might be culturally inappropriate, and if so, I sincerely apologize, but you looked like you wanted to dance earlier during your delegation's demonstration, and I thought maybe." "You are human," Lyrie said, as if this explained everything. Which it probably did. Humans and Veltherin maintained polite diplomatic relations. Cordial, professional. But there was distance, historical tensions from trade disputes decades ago that both species had supposedly moved past but somehow still influenced every interaction. Cultural differences they navigated carefully. They cooperated on galactic council matters, engaged in careful trade agreements, and maintained embassies. But they didn't casually invite each other to dance at formal receptions. "Yes, I'm human," Daniel confirmed. "Is that a no? Because I can absolutely just apologize for the cultural misunderstanding and, if I accept," Lyrie interrupted quietly, "it will cause reactions." "Bad reactions," Because I can definitely. Not bad, just unprecedented. Veltherin and humans do not dance together at these functions. It is not prohibited by any written protocol, but it is not done. We maintain appropriate distance. Always. She paused, her ears performing complex movements Daniel couldn't interpret. But I would like to dance. I watched my people's demonstration and wanted to join but couldn't, some family tensions that are complicated to explain. And I have been standing here watching everyone else interact while I maintain proper diplomatic distance like I'm supposed to, and honestly I'm tired of appropriate distance. Her eyes met his directly. Yes, I accept your invitation, Daniel, right? Let us create reactions. Daniel offered his hand. Lyrie took it. Her fingers were longer than human proportions, warm, slightly trembling, and they stepped onto the dance floor together. A human cultural attaché and a Veltherin junior representative, crossing boundaries that weren't written down anywhere but everyone knew existed. The moment they reached the center of the dance floor, the hall fell absolutely silent. Not gradually, instantly. As if someone had pressed a mute button on 300 conversations simultaneously. Every species in the reception turned to watch. Daniel could feel hundreds of eyes analyzing this breach in unspoken protocol, calculating diplomatic implications, wondering what human Veltherin incident was unfolding before them. The music continued, neutral orchestral piece that offended no one, but it was the only sound. Everything else was silence so profound that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He just created exactly the diplomatic complication his training had warned against. Multiple times, with highlighted sections in his handbook. But Lyrie's hand was warm in his, and her expression held determination mixed with what might be defiant joy. "Everyone is watching," she said quietly, barely audible over the music. "I know, I'm sorry. We can stop if this is going to cause you problems with your delegation." "No." Lyrie's ears tilted forward in the gesture Daniel had learned meant resolve or determination. "We are dancing. Let them watch and calculate diplomatic implications and analyze protocol breaches. We are dancing because you asked with respect and I said yes. That should be sufficient." So they danced. Daniel wasn't particularly skilled, just standard formal dance steps learned for diplomatic functions, basic box step, and turns that wouldn't embarrass him at official events. Lyrie followed his lead smoothly. Veltherin had natural grace that made every movement look intentional and elegant, but the dance wasn't about technical excellence. It was about the fact that they were dancing at all, crossing that invisible line between species who maintained careful distance, who cooperated professionally but never connected personally, who'd allowed historical tensions to create barriers that weren't mandatory but felt inevitable. The silence stretched. Other species continued watching. Daniel saw the Veltherin delegation conferring urgently, animated discussion, ears performing complex movements, clearly debating the implications of their junior representative dancing with a human. He saw his own supervisor looking alarmed, probably calculating how to minimize diplomatic fallout. But the music continued, and so did their dance. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't break the fragile courage required to keep moving while the entire galactic diplomatic community watched in stunned silence. Daniel focused on the steps, basic, simple, nothing fancy. Lyrie followed perfectly, her movements graceful, her hand steady in his despite the attention. Her ears were forward, resolve, Daniel hoped, rather than fear. The song felt impossibly long, like the universe had decided to stretch 3 minutes into an hour, making them dance through the silence while everyone watched and no one intervened. But eventually, finally, the music ended. Daniel and Lyrie stopped dancing but remained standing together on the floor, hands still clasped, surrounded by absolute silence that felt heavier than any sound. Then something unexpected happened. Another human walked onto the dance floor, junior economic analyst Daniel recognized from his own embassy. A Veltherin woman followed him, looking both nervous and determined. They began dancing. The silence broke like a dam releasing. Conversations resumed, but different now. Not returning to safe diplomatic platitudes, but animated discussions about what they'd just witnessed. Debates about protocol, analyses of implications, but also, Daniel noticed, people approaching others across species lines with new openness. A Korath ambassador, species that typically maintained even more rigid boundaries than Veltherin, approached a Teshan diplomat and gestured toward the dance floor. Clear invitation. The Teshan looked surprised, then delighted, and they joined the growing number of couples on the floor. Within minutes, the dance floor transformed from Veltherin-only cultural space to genuinely mixed gathering. Species who'd maintained polite distance for years, who'd never thought to cross invisible boundaries, dancing together because two people had shown it was possible. Daniel and Lyrie stepped off the floor and were immediately surrounded. Lyrie's delegation descended first, not angry exactly, but intensely questioning. Why had she accepted? Didn't she understand the implications? What message was she sending about Veltherin openness to closer human relations? Had she considered the potential complications? Lyrie's responses were quiet, but absolutely firm. I wanted to dance. He invited me with respect. I saw no reason to refuse based purely on species when the only actual barrier was our own habitual distance. If that creates diplomatic complications, perhaps those complications needed to exist to force us all to examine why we maintain such careful separation when it's not required by any actual protocol. Daniel faced similar interrogation from his supervisor, who pulled him aside with expression that mixed alarm and resignation. Do you understand what you just did? Veltherin cultural practices are deeply significant to them. Inviting one to dance at a formal reception could be interpreted as exactly what it was, Daniel interrupted. An invitation to dance with someone who looked like she wanted to dance but was standing alone. That's all. No hidden agenda, no political strategy, no calculated diplomatic move. Just two people dancing because one asked and the other said yes. His supervisor stared at him. That simplicity might be the most diplomatically complicated thing you've ever done. Or, Daniel suggested, maybe maintaining distance that's not required is more complicated than just asking someone to dance. Months later, the incident became famous in diplomatic circles. The dance that broke protocol, written about in journals, analyzed in cultural studies courses, referenced as textbook example of how small gestures can shift entrenched patterns between species. But Daniel and Lyrie both knew the real story wasn't about diplomatic implications or cultural analysis. It was about a moment when someone stood alone wanting to join a celebration, but held back by invisible boundaries, and someone else had enough courage to simply ask, "Would you like to dance?" And her answer, brave in its own way, "Yes." Years later, human-Veltherin relations had warmed considerably. Cultural exchanges included actual mixing rather than parallel demonstrations. Joint programs, collaborative research, genuine friendship between species. The invisible boundaries had been replaced by real connection. People still talked about that reception, about the silence that filled the hall when a human and Veltherin danced together for the first time, about how that silence broke when others followed their example, about how courage in a single moment can challenge barriers maintained for decades. Daniel and Lyrie remained friends. Both had married other people, both had progressed in their diplomatic careers. Daniel now served as senior cultural liaison, Lyrie as Veltherin ambassador to Earth. They didn't dance together often, but they shared understanding of what that moment had meant. Not romance, not grand political statement, just two people deciding that arbitrary distance mattered less than genuine connection, that wanting to dance and being invited to dance should be enough, regardless of species or historical tensions or carefully maintained protocol. "The moment I took the alien woman to dance," Daniel said when diplomatic students asked about the famous incident, the silence filled the hall because no one had done it before. Everyone had maintained distance for so long they'd forgotten it wasn't actually mandatory. We just stopped maintaining it. And once we did, others realized they could stop too. The barriers we thought were necessary were actually just comfortable habits we'd never questioned. And Lyrie, when she told the story to her own people, emphasized the same truth. He invited me with respect. I accepted with courage. The silence was everyone else realizing that barriers they thought were necessary were actually just familiar patterns we'd never examined. Sometimes it takes one person asking and another person saying yes to show everyone else that the distance we maintain isn't inevitable. It's just familiar. The dance had lasted 3 minutes. the silence may be won. But the impact of choosing connection over comfortable distance continued reshaping human welfare and relations for years, all because someone noticed another person standing alone, wanted to include them,